Hello, this is,
City Builders Podcast.
yeah,
I'm Dorian Moore.
and Mark and Nickita, and we are doing a global urban study once again, and what we are calling of course, our typical November 2025 global urban study, and this time we are focusing on two places with a couple of other things scattered in, and it's primarily London and Cardiff. And we're heading to Cardiff tomorrow, and we've been in London the last day and a half or so, and thought we would introduce our conversation with just an overview of what's going on.
It's been a few years since we've been in London, and it was good to get back here and see some of the development. And in the last few days, seeing some things that we haven't even seen before. We've been here over the last
Yeah.
20 plus years.
Yeah,
So, and I think the city, of course, is still amazing. We saw tons of different housing typologies and mixed use, ground floor conditions, a lot of things that we've been looking at and interested in over the last few
Yeah.
years.
Well, I think one of the things I guess we'll restate, because we've probably stated it a number of times, is London has become our favorite city. And that may sound maybe a little boring, given all the cities that we've been to.
Right.
But I think that one of we've done a lot of analysis as to why we like it so much. And a lot of it is things we saw today. But it's the variety, the lack of, I guess, the lack of monotony or typical. I mean, it's always, around every corner, there's new things to see. There's some level of surprise, it seems. And even as many times as we've been here, and I actually don't know how many times I've been here, but it's somewhere in the 20 times. I think you've been a little less. But as many times as we've been here, we still see more, we still learn more, and we still see things that have evolved over the course of a couple thousand years here in the city that have really been an inspiration and noteworthy to observe and study.
And I think one of the things that is important is that, and we touched on it earlier, but I'll say it again, the variety here in the different districts. Walking from one district or neighborhood to another, if you compare it to, say, Paris has an overall consistency, for the most part, in its districts and in the architecture within those districts. And so that there's a certain comfort level with that, there's a certain refinement that comes with that. But London has so many different characteristics of districts, from Camden Town to Bloomsbury to Knightsbridge, Sloane Square. They all have their own sort of different character. And I think that's what's really alluring, while keeping a very similar scale and material palette for the most part.
For the most part, yeah. We were seeing that today as we were walking through Bloomsbury, which is where we typically stay. It's sort of our neighborhood in London. And seeing all the character and the scale and the quality of the buildings and the materials and all of the conditions there. And then all of a sudden, just crossing a street, we go into Clerkenwell, and Clerkenwell, completely different character, different scale, different size of buildings, different articulation, all kinds of variety there, just in those two districts, which are really adjacent. Then, of course, going into Shoreditch, which is also a variation on the theme of Clerkenwell, and then into the City of London, which changes altogether in terms of tight streets, density. It's the oldest part of London.
And ironically, the area with the largest scale
and that was where I was going to go. Over the years, it's evolved into becoming a sort of a skyscraper environment with tall 30, 40, 50-story buildings, which has really not been the case for many years. But in the last 30 years, it's evolved to be quite a sort of a tower center. So it totally changes the dynamic of London, in that area. So they're, in a matter of just maybe a mile or two walk.
Mm-hmm.
Changes dramatically as we go along, which is the whole idea of what you said, which is the variety of everything, and all of the unique conditions. And I think we're also always intrigued with the integration of the historic structures adjacent to the newer structures, some of which are good adjacencies, in some cases it's not so good, but it's good to study, it's good to understand, it's good to see. And those are things that we see as well that we think we find intriguing.
One of the things we failed to mention at the beginning is where we are right now.
Yeah, right? which is another interesting story.
We're in the Brunswick Center, which was a classic. Was it 60s?
Yeah, it's a 60s brutalist
housing development
right.
that we visited a number of times in early trips to London, and it really had that sort of scary, apocalyptic, vacant feel to it. The retail had died. It was run down.
Well, first of all, it's really not a residential project because it's really a mixed-use project, right? So it has retail, it has residential. I don't think there's any office here, but there's a theater as well. So it is one of the early true designed mixed-use projects, and then it was brutalist. It's concrete, of a hard-edged type of structure, but one that I think is intriguing to people. They find it interesting, and like you said, in the early days of us coming to London, which would have been going back into the 1980s and surely into the 90s, it was run down, scary, unpleasant. I don't know if it was full, and I think the retail struggled, and I think the residential was not doing well either. I mean, it looked like there was a lot of lack of investment, let's just say, to be nice about it.
I want to touch on something that you corrected me on. That I'm gonna.
I don't ever do that. Come on. That's like
you do
never.
It,
that never happened. So it was the one time that I did that. You must have caught it.
When you do it, but talking about this as a mixed-use project, which technically it is, but perceptually, in my mind, it's a housing project that just happened to have some retail in this court area, because it doesn't feel integrated.
Well, the way it's designed, we talked about that, how the residential is disconnected from the retail, and it's almost like it's adjacent, not integrated.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think it feels that way. Yeah, you're right. I would definitely add to that point, and I think that's exactly true. But it is technically mixed-use development. It was all developed at the same time, built at the same time. And as we were talking about the other day, because we went to a bookstore, which is literally just right there, about 30 feet away, there's a rise in interest in brutalist architecture, which we find quite interesting. Over the years, seeing brutalist architecture firsthand all over in a variety of different places in the world, it's always been interesting. As anything we study is always interesting, good, bad, and ugly, and beautiful, and it's always interesting and always worth seeing. But I think the brutalist architecture that we've seen hasn't been what we would consider to be the most positive experiences, right?
Very less than humane.
Yeah, because of the concrete nature of it, because of the scale of it, oftentimes the lack of human interaction and scale that's related to it. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you could say brutalist architecture isn't really human scale, and we've experienced although many of them that haven't been very pleasant. But conversely, they're usually very innovative and interesting, and oftentimes unique in the sense that their forms and large scale structures are intriguing and interesting. And so with that comes this sort of fascination with it. And it gets pointed out as it may not be a place that you want to live in necessarily, but it surely is a place that you want to look at.
I think the real interesting thing is there are some, I think, relatively simple key things that can be done to these kinds of places to make them just that much better. And we talked about it earlier when we were walking around. is right now, all of them, the Barbican, this place, and others that are modeled after it, all are inwardly focused. And I understand, you have this grand interior space, but then your back end is out to the street.
Yeah,
And Marchman
it's
Street
absolutely
out
the way it
there
is here.
is an awesome traditional street, but it breaks down at this point. And if they just turn some of this, some small retail liner towards that street and still keep what's in here, I think that would make this thing really feel like it's part of this district, as opposed to sort of a totally different destination at the end of the street.
Well, and I think on the one side you have Marshman Street, which is a great street, like you said, and it turns its back on it essentially. But at the same time, there's Conran's Field right over there, a beautiful green, and it sort of turns its back on the green as well. So you have two sort of assets that the building sits within, and yet it kind of turns its way, which is very common in a lot of brutalist architecture. I mean, we could get into that whole thing. I mean, you could talk about the Renaissance Center, which would be considered brutalist as well in many ways.
But we have another podcast
same team.
on
But
that.
that's another podcast. But intriguingly, this is a common thing with the whole brutalist work. But we found it interesting how brutalism has become popular again. And when we were at the bookstore, we saw 4 books on brutalist architecture, and
celebrating it.
Yeah, and celebrating it and uncovering it, finding it to be something that people are really interested in learning about. So anyway, it's an interesting part of this neighborhood, and it's a neighborhood that we have stayed in for many, many years, and this has been part of it, and we've been able to enjoy the evolution of it from a dark day to would it's really become quite a nice asset here in the neighborhood. But otherwise, we spent time in yesterday. We spent time in this neighborhood, spending a lot more time than we typically do, just kind of looking at some of the little gems, the often overlooked gems in the neighborhood, which is really something. If you really sit there and look carefully, and we're talking about in this neighborhood, we have a whole series of hidden gems, both in terms of buildings, but also in terms of planning.
Yeah.
And we talked about that sort of the period here of a lot of the buildings is Victorian or late 1800s, early 1900s, that period there. But at the same time, the planning is sort of alludes to Baroque planning. A lot of things lining up in axial termination, terminated vistas, axial relationships, all these kinds of things that tie it all together beautifully.
Spaces and greens that are very much, rigid geometries, but all interconnected.
Defined by the architecture very carefully with crescents and squares and circuses. And I mean, it's really, you really can dig deep and find, and that's actually when I was writing notes early, I was deep dive study today, yesterday and today. We actually did something that we don't often do, which is really spend the time sitting there, walking, photographing, and really looking to see the things that the urbanism tells you, and which I think is really interesting.
To put it into perspective for people, we spent probably about 2.5, 3 hours in what would amount to like a 4-block area. Measuring the streets, measuring the mews, measuring laneways. Photographing building types, making notes, looking at retail, looking at housing.
And absolutely. A lot of different things we were looking at a higher level that we don't often do. The signage and integration of public space, depths of buildings.
Types of uses at the ground floor.
And the way that they're integrated with the lower level, with the street level, with the upper level. A lot of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I think from our perspective, a real worthwhile discussion and evaluation, and a lot of documentation there as well. And then today, the other area that we ended up studying was we looked a lot at the retail component, especially as we were going into the city of London, and we spent time at the Spitalfields market. And the Spitalfields market, which is one of our favorite stops for sure, always active and interesting. And at Spitalfields, we really dug down a little bit into new, and meaning historic as well as new retail, and identifying the way that it has grown in the market, the traditional market, plus the areas now that are supplemental around it, and the size is key. The sizes that we see, which is the key component. How big are these historically retail spaces in the old market that now goes back 150 years or something, and these new spaces that are probably 10 years old, and they're the same size.
Right.
And what do we say in the end? A lot of them were about 250 square feet. What was it, like 10, 12 by 14, 15, 18? Yeah, so 250 square feet, and then no more than 500 square feet.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what we kind of, as we looked around. And then they have stalls and things like that, which is a different kind of retail. But the collection of retail in that entire area, for the most part, is really, really small, independent, retailers. And it's a great model for where we see a city as big as London isn't so concentrated solely on these giant retail spaces.
Right.
The chains, the national, the international chains that need 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 feet, even 4,000 or 5,000 feet. These were 200 feet.
Right.
And I think it says a lot for the ability for a city to have variety and to accommodate these smaller businesses that are trying to make their way into the culture in a way that's attainable.
It's a way for a building owner to really make their property stand out, because right now in most of our North American cities, all of the people who are doing building development from a ground floor leasing standpoint are going after the same players. In the States, it's either CVS or Walgreens. In Canada, it's Shoppers Drug Mart or Rexall.
Yeah.
So it's like one of those players everyone's going after, but that's not going to make the project unique, and could detract from the status of the building. Whereas if you start getting some unique players in there, and the square footage starts to add up to close to the same kind of square footage, all of a sudden it becomes a marketing piece for your building.
Yeah.
Sure, they're not going to pay the same kind of rents that a CVS or a Shoppers Drug Mart is going to pay, but the dividends that they'll pay as far as people really looking at your development as a place to move to, I think is very important. And that's one of the big lessons. I think that's a takeaway from just our first few days here in London, looking at these spaces.
What we're seeing is a model that we've seen in cities all over Europe for sure, and then increasingly we're seeing it in cities in North America as well, but only in pockets and in certain areas. But it's a model for innovation. It's a model for independence. It's a model for local businesses. It's a model for businesses that are startups. And we really find that to be an exciting opportunity. I mean, I was thinking about today, while we were in Exmouth Market, down toward the city center, there was a stationery store, which the woman was in there.
Yeah.
She was the designer, and she was making the stationery, and she had all the stuff on the wall. And it was a great little store, and she was working there. Personal, local, quality was great, and it was just a perfect example of this kind of business that you could just tell that she loved this kind of thing. She was creating the product, and people were walking in and really enjoying it. And it was a great model. And we were looking at this bookstore over here, the Brunswick Bookshop. which is another example. That's an independent. Brunswick, it's clearly, for this space. It's named after this space. And again, an independent, and I think the people in there were the owners when we were in there. And these are the kinds of things that I think we see all over the place. And we're encouraged by the fact that not only is retail not dead, like a lot of people would like to say, retail's dead because of, online and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is we're seeing that there's no such thing as retail is dead.
Right.
We're seeing every one of these stores are full. Everywhere we walked, there was a significant amount of retail as well as service, depending on where it is. But it surely wasn't, we didn't see a whole lot of empty storefronts. And that's typically what we see in most cities.
Now one thing we should bring up, because we talked about this, is we haven't seen a lot of empty spaces, but we did talk about, what I call the food apocalypse.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
The fact that a lot of what we're seeing in a lot of places,
too much food
in the States. Yeah, too much food, too many restaurants.
There's just too much food.
Yeah, exactly. And that always concerns us when our economy swings toward one specific kind of use, whether it's housing production, which we seem to be behind on everywhere in the world all at once. Now we're looking and we're seeing restaurants everywhere.
We do find it to be a concern because there's only so much that you can support with so much population. A city like London is very big, so there's a lot of people to feed. There's a lot of people obviously going around ready to buy food for lunch, dinner, what have you. But the reality is there's only so much, even in a city like this. So it's something we're seeing more and more of. You can't just depend on your retail centers being populated by food places. Yeah. And I think that's what we're finding a little too much of. So it's just something to be aware of, something we've noticed. So.
Yeah, and so we have a lot planned for this trip. As we said, we're getting ready for Cardiff, to do our global urban study there. We wanted to do this intro to talk about what we've seen so far, where we want to go, the fact that November is Global Urban Study Month.
Yeah. I'm going to set that up. Let's set up Global Urban Study Month. Yeah, I like that.
For sure.
Yeah, well, definitely November. The beginning of November is clearly a time that fits our schedule to do touring as we typically are for the last 25 years. We're out most Novembers. Short of a couple, have been time for us to travel somewhere. But there's a lot to see here. We got a number of other things to cover, and we'll be in a number of other cities as well while we're here. And of course, until we get to that point, in the meantime, what we will be doing, of course, is walk the streets.